sitting down with Travis Oliphant to go over open source enterprise open source. And Travis is an accomplished open source developer and executed an executive that has created open source technologies that are being used over 30,000 companies across 80% of the enterprise. Travis created NumPy, SciPy, Numba, and also NumFOCUS, PyData, Anaconda, and Quansight, and most recently, OpenTeams. So Travis, thank you for being here and for funding this event.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, and we have a very interesting topic to talk to you, to talk to everyone about. In this session, we're going to address the topic of enterprise open source. Now, recent studies have shown that 80% of organizations are using open source for mission-critical applications. So that's 9 out of 10 companies use open source. But unlike proprietary systems, where companies can get support and continuous development, open source doesn't always have that luxury unless it's company-backed. And what we'd like to know is for companies looking for enterprise support, Travis, where can they get it and what can they expect from that support if it's not company-backed?
Yeah, well, let's back up a step and talk about enterprise open source, because you're introducing a new term many people may not be aware of. I mean, open source, enterprise open source is sort of a useful concept. And the idea is really just to solidify use of open source so that enterprise can trust it, just like they might, for a lot of years, I've been doing this for 20 years. 10 years ago, companies would be using open source and would be thinking, oh man, I don't have a vendor to go to. The lawyers particularly would go, who backs this? I've got the license right. What does this mean? I got to have more. I got to have something here to protect me. And recently, people have gotten more comfortable with realizing that community-driven open source or open source that's company-backed does have a lot of support, actually. It's not like you're just going in the Wild West and there's nobody to help you. There's a lot of people helping you. In fact, most of the popular approaches to software are open source fundamentally. So it's changed people's thinking to say, well, is there really a difference between open source and enterprise open source? And the answer is yes, there still is. It's more about a question of quality, and then how do I get the support I'm looking for? And I would say the ecosystem of enterprise support for open source is still evolving, but there are now more options than ever to get the help you need to make sure open source can be a trusted feature of your enterprise deployments, of everything in your organization. No longer do you have to just go to a company to get software because they're the only ones that can support it. You can go today, use any open source you like, get some advice as to which ones you should depend on, and then get support for that open source. OpenTeams offers a general open source support contract. We can support your use of open source for how do I use it, what do I do, how do I get bugs fixed, kind of bug fix support. And that's a unique offering, one of the first of its kind. There's a company called Tidelift, for example, that offers a identification, security, kind of a maintenance open source for a wide variety of open source projects that fit under their support contract. So you at least you have multiple options now to ensure that if you're concerned about those factors, and that's a reason you haven't been taking advantage of the wealth of technology that's around, and really to help you save time and money in your organization, then that's not a concern anymore. You can actually solve that problem today. So I think these are important things people need to be aware of and need to start contemplating, because their competitors are doing it. People around you are doing it. And so they're going to save time and money. They're going to save the effort. They're not going to be spending the money that you're otherwise spending trying to build out and maintain the software infrastructure yourself. Everybody needs technology. Every single company out there relies on technology. Almost all of that technology has foundations on open source and open source communities. And so it's not something you can just bury your head in the sand and forget about and just go to your one vendor. We're trying to fix that. We're trying to help people to navigate the large ecosystem of available expertise and give them a place to go to help them.
So if there was a list of questions as you're picking to introduce a new open source technology into your environment, and there was a list of checklist of things that you need to consider, what would those be, right? So you mentioned a few about the security. You mentioned a few about who's behind that? Is that a foundation? Is it a company? Is it a community? What would your suggestion and guidance be to companies as they adopt new open source?
I think we have what's called a business suitability score that we've come up with that averages 6 or 7 different, we have scores on 6 or 7 dimensions, for example. The dimensions we've looked at that are important to understand are, the IP, the license, what's it under? Is it a license that requires you to, as you build on the open source, do you have to make the stuff you build open source? Is it a open license? Are you protected from patents that might creep into that license, into the software you're using? So your IP risk, I think the community health is something you have to look at, particularly the more you rely on it. How many developers are in the community, how many maintainers, how many users, is it popular? Are other people using it? There's kind of the decreased risk of going with the flow. Not always the right idea, that's always the best idea, but at least it gives you some comfort that if you're stranded on an island, you'll be stranded together with a bunch of people and you can solve the problem together. Then things like the dependencies, that's often an important overlooked issue, is a particular project might have a list of dependencies and one of the dependencies is actually not well supported. So you need that score to be recursively computed to ensure that the dependencies of the project that you're leaning on also are well supported. So those are some of the factors. I think security is critical. Security typically, the open source, you can have security issues with people injecting code into the open source project. That's less of a risk these days, but it can happen, and that really can happen with projects that are maintained by one person or 2 people. Like the more maintainers that are on a project, the more people that are actually contributing code and reviewing pull requests, the less that becomes an issue. But if there's one person, and there are a lot of projects out there with not very many maintainers, and so it becomes a risk that you can have, inappropriate code built. It's kind of surprising that doesn't happen more often, perhaps, but it can happen. The bigger risk actually is when you're downloading binary artifacts from the internet. That's an easier vector to interfere with. That some of these large-scale public repositories, have 2 kinds of problems, multiple kinds, but 2 very common ones are you just type the name wrong a little bit, and there's a misspelled version of that package that's actually a Trojan horse sitting on somewhere else, and you can easily, accidentally pull it in instead of getting a typo and a syntax error. You get something you didn't want. So, where are you getting libraries from? Where you're getting the binaries from has become a critical question for a lot of people. They rely on open source, but want to make sure the binary artifacts they're either building themselves or getting from a trusted vendor like Anaconda or Red Hat or somebody else. So that's an important question: is where am I getting? Supply chain is important. I think it's important to have somebody review that. So a lot of organizations are creating what the open source program offices, OSPOs. Big organizations can usually do that. Smaller organizations, even those large organizations, should really take advantage of the vendors out there and the communities out there that are providing help to help you accomplish those goals. Things like the OpenTeams business suitability score, things like some of the offerings that we have that we and other vendors have to help people manage that risk.
That's really good, a really good checklist for companies as they're looking at different open source components. One thing you did bring up is the interoperability of open source. So absence of a standardized licensing body makes it very useful for people to know which combination of products and open source variations work together, and what are the best practices to be implemented when you're trying to bring in different open source components with your products to make them all work together for your project? What do you suggest there? What should they be looking for?
That's a good question.
Who can they trust?
That's a good question. I think ultimately this is still resolving. I mean, this is one of those areas that's going to continue to be with us, which is how do we make all this incredible explosion of technology and innovation work together well. It's fortunately that interoperability is also being pursued with the same kind of community-driven and cooperation that we've seen in creation of open source projects. But I would be looking for, are there emerging standards around a particular topic. I mean, if you look at databases, for example, and SQL emerged as a standard for how do I query databases, rather than have everybody have their own language for querying databases. There was a lot of cooperation that created SQL. Now there's variations of SQL, and people are still innovating around the SQL language, but at least it became a really strong standard. In the same way, we have standards emerging around things like array computing and data frame computing. In fact, that's one of the areas we need a little more work right now. There's also standards emerging around binary data formats. How I store my data? Is it an open format with lots of tools around it, or is it in some specific, proprietary or underused format? How I use the data. Interoperability starts to matter when it comes to APIs. Are the APIs open? Is the tool I'm using have a standardized open API, and does that API have software development kits or SDKs that are available in multiple languages, or is that there's one way to access it? Is the way to access it modern? Is it using modern approaches like REST and JSON interaction, or is it SOAP and XML and some of the older approaches to interacting with APIs? So these are I can tell a little bit of the anecdote of data APIs, data-apis.org, which is I got my start in Python by writing SciPy and starting that project with several of my friends. But NumPy is what I'm actually most known for. NumPy, the whole point of NumPy was actually to create an interoperable array library that tried to unify the libraries that were diverging. So I've kind of built a career out of creating interoperability effectively. Anaconda is a interoperable packaging approach. So it can package and pull together multiple languages. So instead of just being a package manager for one language, it's a package manager for any language and any product, any story. So keeping in mind that because of people get really focused on a thing they do well, the open source you pull in, you might inadvertently be pulling in a narrower view of the world, an interoperability problem that can easily happen. And so it does mean that you do need to get advice, get help, get expertise, get someone to help you, an architect to help you navigate that interoperability difficulty that could be arising, maybe unbeknownst to you. And so as that evolves, I think interoperability is important. A lot of good projects, Arrow is another good project that's emerged as an interoperable binary form approach, a way to store and compute on data in a interoperable way. But the data APIs project is helping to define a data frame standard. It's already defined a great array standard, so that lots of projects like PyTorch and NumPy and Iron Array and other array concepts use the same API to talk about array programming in Python. We need the same kind of energy across multiple other disciplines. So looking for that, what's the energy there? Sometimes people replace that cooperative energy with just, well, who's winning? And that also sometimes you just go, well, where's the standard going to be? Because there's a de facto standard emerging because of popularity of a project. You have to be careful, because typically that's one area that's very manipulatable by venture capital money. Basically what's been happening is a lot of VCs have essentially been buying influence by promoting a particular technology that isn't actually coming from users. It's just being pushed down from marketing spend. That's definitely been happening. And what I prefer is to see, it's fine to market something, but I love to see when it's kind of bubbling up from users. NumPy came to dominate Python, not because anybody spent any marketing money, because everybody used it. Pandas came to become the data frame standard, not because there was any money to market it, but because people adopted it. So kind of where did that come from, and why is that happening is important to understand, especially in our world today with lots of investment money chasing the next biggest Databricks or the next Red Hat.
That is that great insight into that question, and follow up to that one, because it's important. Often organizations miscalculate the total cost of ownership for their open source systems because they underestimate the amount of work, and they're influenced by that big marketing message you talked about required with open source. What are your thoughts regarding how to calculate the time, the skills, the cost for one of these projects? All right, what should how should they do that?
Good questions. It's actually difficult. I mean, there's rules of thumb that you can still apply, in the sense that the cost it takes to implement any system, you're going to have to spend some percentage of that cost in maintenance. And that's just going to be true, right? And those numbers range from 10 to 20%. Sometimes you can get it lower than that if you have if your system is mostly cobbling together open source software. Like the less you're changing open source, the more it's just more merging together open source projects and putting things at a high level wrap around it. You can reduce those maintenance costs to 5%, for example. It really depends on that's kind of the calculus. It's like if you go all in and you're going to do everything yourself and modify the open source and own it, then your maintenance costs may grow. The challenge with maintenance costs is if you don't keep spending them and keeping your technical debt at bay, you'll end up with essentially a new project you have to build within 5 years. These days, 4 to 5 years, you'll have to spend that money again. And I've talked to lots of managing directors and lots of folks in large organizations who bemoan this, and it becomes frustrating because just as you've spent $50 million on a particular software rollout, you find that 4 years later you have to spend another $50 million, and it feels like, wait, we're just constantly treadmill here. And that actually can be if you're not building on standards, if you're not building open source, if you're not leveraging the power of the communities that are out there, you find yourself continually spending a lot of money on software. But there's another way, and that way is to leverage the open source ecosystem, support those communities with key lighthouses placed at the right places to ensure that what's producing is helping you, and then understanding there is a commitment you have to make long term. And there's it's not like I'm just going to build this and done. Think there's going to be some maintenance costs. We're going to get that down. And there are other ways to position that. Maybe it's through supporting foundations. Maybe it's through supporting innovative approaches to supporting open source. But anyway, there's going to be a cost. You minimize it by not changing, like relying on open source components and supporting the communities that will maintain those components, and then ensuring that you're thinking closely about what your business value is and what you're building, and focus on that. Focus on the delivery of what you're building, rather than the whole entire infrastructure that's needed for what you're building.
Oh yeah, they're great answers and good best practices. Now what we're going to do here, because we have 10 minutes left before the end of the session, is we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. And if they don't have any questions, I have several I would like to ask. But if you would like to type your comment in the chat, and we will a question in the chat, and we will answer it. So as we wait, I will go ahead and ask another one. To follow up on that question you just, the last best practice you shared, what can organizations do to ensure the longevity of the software that they're using on open source? Travis, you kind of mentioned in the end, you talked about foundations, you talked about participation. It's not I just install it and use it, but there is a investment that they have to continue doing. And how should they do that to ensure that that software keeps getting developed with open source?
Great question. I think I'll start with something Meta just did. Meta just handed PyTorch over to a foundation, right? Big work. I talked to Sumith. He's a strong open source champion. Started PyTorch project inside of Meta. Has long wanted to make sure that the open source project PyTorch became more community driven, right? Migrated from company back to community driven. So I think one thing you can do as an organization with some influence is actually to encourage that activity, encourage the open source software you depend on to become part of a foundation. And there's actually many foundations out there that'll be fiscal sponsors of your project these days. There's NumFOCUS, there's Linux Foundation, there's Software Conservancy. And so, all it takes is a little bit of communication with the community leaders, community maintainers to encourage that, and it can happen. So that's one way. And then, making a regular donation to that community. I think looking for ways to sponsor community work orders, community-driven activity. These are simply little projects you want to get done. For example, there's an emerging site, ossgrants.com. It's very alpha mode right now, and it's basically doing small development grants for open source, a place you can people can actually put grants together. So a little sponsorship, these small development grants, is an initiative that NumFOCUS started and that other people do, but it's a way to kind of ensure you're helping to encourage the features you care about get into the open source. So I think just recognizing that's part of your budget as you have your engineering budget put together, recognize that a part of your budget should be going to support the open source you depend on.
And as a follow-up question to that one, many companies, we've talked about support. We've talked about, working with the open source community, foundations, sponsorship. 40% of companies have put together open source program office to help manage that. But there may be a lot of people that are trying to figure out what should I do that? How will that help me? Can you share your insights a little bit about this governance structure that companies have put together to help them coordinate these efforts?
Yeah, I think that's a good movement in the sense that there are a lot of factors to think about. I mean, my goal personally is to help those open source program offices be 1 to 2 people. Like I like it, but effectively they can get a lot of the support they need from the community. Maybe larger for large organizations because there's different factors to consider. Like one, it depends on what's driving that initiative. Sometimes it's licensing concerns. Sometimes it's how do I have a general message to my organization about how to contribute to open source. A lot of companies appropriately have a concern about just turning on the lights and saying, hey, everybody here can just contribute to open source projects. There's questions around that. Wait a minute, are you speaking for my organization as you're doing that open source contribution, or are you individually? But there's answers to those questions. There's actually a lot of the Apache Foundation's done a lot of work on this to ensure that developers have a developer voice instead of their company voice. But there's questions like that. I would say iterate. Understand what your specific goals are for your open source program office, and what are the priorities for it. And there's a long list of other things you'll get from it. Look to see how much of that you can actually outsource, how much of that is available from an organization that you can partner with, that can actually give you, half of your open source program office capability without spending twice the money, right? How do you do? There's an easy way to think about that. Happy to talk to anybody about that question as well. That's exactly what I love helping people do is help organizing their thinking around supporting open source communities and the open source that they depend on. It may depend on how much open source you're producing. Like, is that part of your strategy internally, is to have the company produce open source? So these are kind of different factors involved in these open source program offices. Am I going to be absorbing open source and making sure the licenses are right? Am I worried about producing open source internally and using that as a developer growth, developer engagement, engineering engagement mechanism for my organization? What's the purpose of this office? Is it a risk mitigation? Am I trying to understand the software I'm depending on, and can I ensure that what I'm depending on is going to be sustained and supported? And how do I then think about influencing those communities? Do I have a regularized approach? Because that can be very important. For example, if you're an organization and you're depending on 1,000 open source projects or 10,000 open source projects, which is not hard to do, right? It's very possible that your efforts to support and sustain are essentially focused on 5 of them, right? And then the other 99 or 95 are getting no interest from you, right? And that's I think an important thing to recognize is, wait a minute, I need to make sure that we're not just shoring up one thing and then having this massive hole in another thing, another part of the ecosystem that I'm not aware of. So it really, I think it's an opportunity. There are people out there that to help you. One nice thing these days, there's 40 years of open source engagement, and there are people that have spent decades in open source communities that you can actually lean on to help provide advice. And many of those, maybe some of those want to come and join you as a full-time employee in your open source program office, but often maybe they don't. Maybe they're just willing to give you some time and some consulting time to work on these problems. So take advantage of that. There's a lot of expertise out there. But it is one of those things that takes, if somebody doesn't have at least 10 years of experience in the open source ecosystem, there's holes. I've spent 25 years in the open source ecosystem. I still have things I'm learning. There's still things I'm trying to understand and trying to really nail about how this works and how it helps business. And so it can be challenging to find that right help. But it is out there. There are people out there who can help you.
It is out there, and I know Travis and the team at OpenTeams is willing to provide that support too. So what we're going to do is I appreciate, Travis, for your time today, and I know you're willing to give a little bit more help and guidance to people as they reach out So we're going to put this presentation out on the TechShare website, on the OpenTeams website, and we'll send out an email with opportunity for you to engage on more of a one-on-one discussion with Travis, Lalitha, and others at OpenTeams around enterprise open source support, open source program office, how to work with the open source community. So I really appreciate your time, Travis, for you being here. We will have next session with Darhas Pothina on the best Python open source dashboarding tool for fintech companies. So that one is upcoming here in a couple of minutes. So if you need to take a break, we'll give you a short break and then we'll resume shortly. Thank you, Travis, for your time.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.